And we're live.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for attending today's talk. Let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ryan Boyd. Dr. Ryan Boyd is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, and we are excited to have him here as a recent addition to our faculty. He completed his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin in 2017 and has held positions as assistant professor of behavioral analytics at Lancaster University and associate research professor at Stony Brook University. Dr. Boyd is widely recognized for his extensive research on how everyday language reveals a person's motives, personality, and thinking style. He has also contributed significantly to the field by developing innovative text analysis software used by researchers around the world. Many more things I'm sure we'll hear about. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ryan.
For having me out here. The room is making me a little nervous. I've seen Godfather 3 many times. So like as soon as the doors close, it's like I'm waiting for the helicopter. Yeah. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about how I got into this stuff. The talk is basically chopped into two halves today. So the first half is really just kind of me and my background, a lot of the ideas that I work with and operate under, a lot of the, say, intellectual traditions of where I'm coming from. Then the second half is just kind of a smorgasbord of random projects that either kind of ongoing at the moment or recently published, stuff like that. As always, I'm totally happy to completely go off the rails. If there's stuff in the projects, if you're all just like, this is stupid, let's talk about other stuff, I'm totally cool with that. That's great too. My usual thing is once you get me started talking about this stuff, you'll never get me to shut up. So, if I go on too long, you can be one of those old like vaudeville hooks and yank me out or something like that. So I started off in a PhD program it was supposed to be social and health psychology, but a lot of it was really more kind of affective, cognitive types of research. So it was a lot of this stuff where bring people in the lab, you have them slap at a keyboard for a half hour, then you pretend that you've discovered all kinds of important things about human psychology. And it was really boring and tedious work. And I really didn't know why I was doing what I was doing. So a lot of what we were doing was we bring people in and prime them for some condition. So, have them write for 5 minutes about a time where they felt agentic and in control, or have them write for 5 minutes about a time where they felt submissive and powerless. And then we would see how that influenced their downstream performance on different cognitive tasks. And one week, the data got decoupled from the studies we were running in the lab. So we knew what conditions people wrote in, and we had all the kind of behavioral data from interacting with the experiments, but they got essentially separated. So we had to go through and manually link them back together. And so I spent a weekend just with two spreadsheets open, one spreadsheet with the language data, and then another spreadsheet with all the stuff where they would, we'd flash a line on the screen for 500 milliseconds, and they'd try to click and figure out where the line had appeared and so on. And so I'm reading the stuff that people wrote to figure out what condition they'd been assigned to, and then looking at the numbers on this other spreadsheet. As I'm going through hour after hour, reading the stuff people are writing, I start to get this really deep sense that, people are writing all these really intimate personal experiences, times where they were children and were in trouble and didn't have control over their own lives, or times when they were adults or students where, things were going really well in their lives or really poorly. And I'm flashing back and forth between these two, all of this really rich kind of subjective experiential stuff. And then like 3 columns of just numbers. And I was like, this is what I got in the game for. Like, this is people's experiences. This is their lives. This is the stuff that actually matters. And so I made a decision pretty quickly that that's what I want to pursue. I want to figure out how is there a way to approach that type of data from an empirical, objective perspective. And it led to this really, really long rabbit hole where, at the time there was already some software where you could calculate psychological metrics from language data. And as I started getting deeper in that world and looking at the software, I was like, well, I can do that. That's not that complicated. And just kept going and going and going. And now here I am overlooking a golf course for some reason. So, really getting interested in language, it broadened my horizons massively. So I started off doing a lot of that work, doing, kind of power manipulations or these kind of vaguely social cognitive manipulations. And from there, then I just started branching out to lots and lots of different stuff. Virtually any aspect of the human condition I was curious about, you can find language about it, either online in kind of historical data, or you can bring people in the lab and have them write for 5 minutes and get this whole constellation of psychological information about them just from their language. Whereas again, the same amount of information might take an hour of filling bubble on, various self-report questionnaires and so on. And so I just started exploring pretty much everything that I was curious about. Now, this is a kind of intentionally crappy baked slide. I like to say that most of the stuff that I do these days falls in one of these three big buckets: affect, personality and individual differences, or differential psychology, and then social and interpersonal processes. But the truth is that all of these things are much more interconnected than something like this would have you believe. Anything that's being studied in my lab from a social processes perspective probably involves affect or individual differences in some regard. And you can connect all of these things in, machine learning person, say it looks like a fully connected network. And I think that this really speaks to the fact that language underlies so much of the human experience. You can use people's verbal behavior to dive deep into virtually anything that you're interested in: how they think, how they feel, how they move through the world, how they make decisions, what their identity is. Everything about a person can really be encoded in their language and then pulled back out and used to study it from a very classic scientific perspective in a lot of ways. Now, one of the things that I really love about language analysis, is this breadth that lets you just study all different kinds of topics under essentially one roof, so to speak, using lots of different approaches and methods and so on. So going to go a little bit into the history of some of this work, just so you have a sense of where these ideas are coming from. There's a lot of people doing language analysis these days. Most of it is, I think, on its surface, disconnected from these older and broader ideas, but it all connects in some form or another to where this stuff comes from, so to speak. Despite the various traditions, whether we're talking about people in linguistics or sociolinguistics or computer science or data science or sociology or anthropology, doesn't really matter. A lot of it, when it comes to what can you measure about people from their language, can really trace its roots back to some very early thinkers in this space. So there are kind of a set of people in the early days of psychology, the golden era of kind of thinking about language, so to speak. Now, people have long thought that verbal behavior and language is important. It tells you something about people's psychology. So Francis Galton, the guy who is credited with the lexical hypothesis, which is pretty foundational in personality psychology, he thought that our words reflect really deeply, richly evolved social needs that we have to communicate about people to people, things that are really key to the evolutionary process of humans being social animals, needing to share critical information. Ferdinand de Saussure thought that language provides scaffolding or structure of human thought, and so on. And then, of course, there's all the classics: Sigmund Freud, Carl Jung, etc. But really, at the end of the day, what all this comes down to is this idea that a person's words, the words that we're using in everyday life, tell us something important about people, about their society or the human mind in some form or another. And that carried forward into early works in this space. So things like the phonetic apperception test or the Rorschach blot test. The idea being that you can have someone use language, use verbal behavior to describe some abstract or ambiguous image. And that should tell you about their preoccupations, their predispositions, and so on. It should essentially tell you what's on their mind, so to speak. Now, fast forward to 1942, where Gordon Allport, one of my all-time favorite psychologists, he published this monograph. It was a report that was commissioned by Social Science Research Council here in the US, and essentially laid a foundation. He took the field to task and said lots of people are using language data. People like Freud, lots and lots of other types of psychologists, largely coming from psychoanalytic traditions, are using language data, but they're not being scientific about it. They're using it more as kind of evidence to support theories that they already have. They're cherry picking language snippets that inform, confirmation bias types of things happening. And so he laid out a very thorough and very scientific framework for how can we approach the study of language and psychology in using all of these standard tools of the trade that anyone else operating in a respectable side of the sciences would use. Now, he laid out a lot of key ideas that are still in operation today. This is a fairly obscure document that most people don't know about, but if you're interested, you can find just mountains of deep insights in there about how language reveals psychology, essentially. Fast forward another 20 years or so, and you see the first attempts to formalize a lot of those ideas using computational methods. So the General Inquirer was a rather large and very, very early text analysis system that was designed specifically for the purpose of measuring psychological and sociological constructs in language. And this is one of these cases where I think a lot of psychologists who are interested in language don't know about this. It's also fairly obscure today, but it's the case that this is early natural language processing. This is early NLP. And psychologists were in on the ground floor. They got off and on the elevator at different points throughout the history of language analysis, but they were deeply involved in the early formulation of computerized text analysis for lots of different purposes. And they used this essentially early on to replace human coders in lots and lots and lots of different types of tasks. And it took off very, very quickly. And virtually any topic that people study today across the social sciences, they were looking at those exact same topics back then. This is over 60 years ago now, and making some serious headway. And, these were people with insane access to financial resources and intellectual resources. A lot of it now, I think, seems a little quaint, especially when we're talking about, very small sample sizes and, doing things like TAT and Rorschach tests. But there are a lot of really early, outstanding scientific works in this area. Now, the General Inquirer got really big in the 1960s, and then by 1970, it essentially imploded. It caved in on itself for a lot of reasons I won't get into here. Largely, it was just very, very big. This is in the time where you need a room this size and rent out mainframe computers to run this stuff. And it was just tedious, expensive, and not super feasible. A lot of people continued doing different types of computerized language analysis, to measure all kinds of things, largely in really fragmented and non-unified theoretical frameworks. A lot of kind of neo-Freudian types of analyses and so on for the next 20 years. And then you get to the early 1990s, where this rascal right here, Jamie Pennebaker, and his then grad student, Martha Francis, while they were at SMU, developed linguistic inquiry and word count. The idea here was essentially to approach the analysis of language data using similar methods that had been used for decades at that point, but make it a lot more scientific, a lot more rigorous, and importantly, a lot easier to use. This was at the time where people were starting to get more and more access to personal computing. This is when you finally, as an academic, have an actual desktop computer in your office and things like that. And that paired with lots of other types of things that they were doing with the software led it to really take off very, very quickly as kind of the standard tool for analyzing language data for the purpose of psychological inference. And it is still to this day very, very easy to use. It's straightforward. It operates using a word counting principle. So you have all these dictionaries that we've developed over 30 years now that correspond to different constructs that we want to measure. So easy things are things like positive negative emotion words. We got a list of words and phrases that, statistically speaking, more often than not, indicate someone is experiencing a positive emotion or a negative emotion, or social words, death words, thinking words, cognitive processing words, things like this. We have these lists of words, goes into a text, counts up the number of words that belong to each of those categories, and you get just very transparent, simple scores, relative frequency scores. What percentage of a text is related to social processes, positive emotions, self-focus, and on and on. Now, all of this is really operating under a principle that was around at the time of the Harvard General Inquirer. It's what we call the words as attention approach. The key idea here is that the words that we use tell us in some fuzzy way what it is that we're paying attention to. So a lot of early content coding work, really the assumption there was that language tells us what is on a person's mind. That's still to some degree true today. Now, there's some nuances to that interpretation. So if we're talking about things like positive emotion words, a lot of people by default assume that that's telling us, well, how happy is a person? How positive are they? Really, what it's telling us is to what degree are they thinking along a dimension of positive emotions? How much are they thinking in terms of positivity? So someone could just as easily say, I'm feeling depressed or sad today. If they choose to say, I'm not happy, that tells us that they're thinking along that dimension of positive emotions. Now, the two tend to correlate very strongly with each other, but it's a nuanced distinction. And here's a very simple example of what this looks like. You essentially take a text and then you can just code it for all these different categories of language. Very simple, very straightforward, very intuitive in a lot of ways. And it's not that different from what we often do if you ask undergrad research assistants to go through and code a text. If you ask them to estimate how self-focused is a person, they're looking for self-referential language words like I, me, I, and so on. And this has been the dominant model for lots and lots of time. And then you can use these types of measures the same way you use any other type of metric in your research. So you can fold these in with measures of things like heart rate variability or skin conductance or self-report questionnaires. These just become additional psychological measures of what's happening in a person's mind, essentially. Now, this is where I came into the world of language analysis, where I was saying, okay, we can measure all these things. Let's fold this into traditional studies. And so early work that I was doing in this space was kind of in the political psychology realm, trying to understand, can we see motivational differences between people who lean liberal versus lean conservative in the language they use in everyday life? So we looked at liberal versus conservative chat rooms and news websites and state of state and state union addresses. And I was approaching this from the very classic social psychological perspective. There's a bunch of research that suggests that liberals tend to define things that are morally good in terms of their affiliative capacity. Liberals tend to like people who get along with other people and so on. There's also a lot of work suggesting that conservatives tend to skew towards preference for things like social dominance orientation. This idea that society should be structured in hierarchies. There should always be people on top and always people on bottom and so on. And so you can map this onto things like to what degree is a person using affiliation words versus power words. Power words in a very classic McClellan needs type of sense. So not I should always be on top, but using words that reflect social structure, social hierarchy, both the kind of powerful people and the people who are on the bottom, so to speak. So we analyzed all this data and we found effectively what we were expecting to see, that conservatives tend to use more power words than liberals. Liberals tend to use more affiliation words than conservatives across all of these domains. And so we found support for our hypotheses. Hooray, got a paper out of it. I was motivated to continue on. Now, that's a very simple example of just saying, okay, here are some things you want to measure in language, and we're just going to fit this in contexts where essentially what we're looking for is ecological validity. Sure, we can bring undergrads into a lab and have them fill out social dominance orientation questionnaires and so on, but we want to see what do people actually do outside of the lab. And this idea too is one of the many strengths of these types of methods. We can scale the same methods up once we've built out a nice nomological network of what these different indices in language tell us. We can start throwing them into lots and lots of different contexts. And so we've done this with lots of different verbal behavioral measures of things like thinking styles, how people make decisions and make judgments and view other people and so on. Looking at things like very, very long-term shifts in politics over the course of the past couple hundred years. So, if we want to measure how analytic someone thinks, how they tend to think in a structured, formal sense, we can't like dig up George Washington and have him fill out a questionnaire, have him take a cognitive test or anything like that, but we can analyze his language, his State of the Union addresses, his personal writings, letters that he wrote to other people, and so on. And we can track that over time. What we found was that starting around 1900 or so, especially in US politics, but the same holds true in a lot of Western European countries as well, you start to see these shifts towards people being elected who are less kind of formal and analytic and much more intuitive types of decision makers, thinkers, and also a lot more confident. So you can see this in its resolution with the election of people like Donald Trump. Very intuitive, you might say, in terms of how he's kind of making decisions and interacting and giving speeches, and also very confident. If nothing else, he's very confident. Now, all of this is just using this basic, simple word counting type of approach. Things are changing drastically in the past 10 years, really even the past 3 or 4 years. There have been these absolutely seismic paradigm shifts in natural language processing, the types of algorithms and tools and methods you can use to extract information from language and then map it onto various psychological constructs. So this includes innovations like differential language analysis. Can you tell statistically what types of words tend to differentiate groups or people or so on, to things like topic modeling can be used essentially a data sifting technique to figure out what are the different topics that are occurring in a large body of text. What are the things that people are talking about? Very kind of exploratory, open-ended question. And then more recently, this massive rise in different types of embedding models, essentially vector representations of semantics. So you can mathematically represent what it is that the text means. And these are the same principles that even things like ChatGPT are based on, these contextual embedding models, for example. And so not only are we getting more and more tools to do new things, but these allow us to ask new types of questions that we couldn't ask before in more nuanced ways and apply them to lots and lots of different types of data sets. So essentially, new methods are opening new doors to studying things that is broad and far-ranging as cognitive processes, cognitive mechanisms, personality, well-being, aging, identity, social, interpersonal interactions, conversations, all of these. People are breaking new ground in these areas virtually every day now because of the rise of these tools. So with that, I'll transition to just giving you kind of a random peppering some recent work that I've been involved in. It's come out of my lab. Now, I noted before that my research is really, really broad. I do, for any of the grad students, don't do what I do, which is like just everything super broad. You have advice telling you like pick a research topic, stick with it, build a career, and then expand. I did not do that. Don't be like Brian. So I do lots and lots of different stuff. These are things that I picked for 2 reasons. One is that they're relatively recent, but also because I think you'll be able to kind of squint and see some connections between them in terms of kind of the train of thought, the different types of things that you can do with these. You can see how each one of these, at the very least methodologically, could be applied to lots of different domains, lots of different constructs, and so on. So that's really my goal here. a lot of these are, especially the first ones are kind of darker topics. So treat that, I'm going to be superficial and all this, super hand wavy, but so we'll treat it as kind of a snack bar, starting with the vegetables and then working our way up to whatever desserts are in the boxes. So start off with some research that me and a few teams of people who've been heading up on suicidality and really more than anything, suicide risk. So this project is one of the first places where we, and by we I mean kind of the broader NLP community, has started to fuse a lot of the more recent, say, computationally intensive methods and natural language processing models with actual psychological theory. So it's not that we're just taking something off the shelf and putting it through a machine learning meat grinder and trying to predict some type of outcome, which has been the MO for a lot of computational social science for the past 10 or 15 years. But instead, we're saying, let's take these really high-powered tools and essentially inject them with theories that we have about the constructs that we want to understand and just see if that actually helps. If we can essentially have our cake and eat it too, get the best of both worlds. Clearly, I'm hungry. I'm talking about snack bars and cake. So we've started by looking at multiple theories of suicide risk. So there are a lot of different theories about the reasons people commit suicide, the ways in which people come to be able to die by suicide in the first place, and so on. And we're essentially starting in a very theory agnostic space where we're saying, okay, here's all these different theories, all these different constructs that have either been proposed to be related to suicide, the actual commission of the act of suicide, or at the very least have been studied to some passing degree and have showed links to suicidality in some form or another. So essentially, we start off with this. We have a list of about 25 constructs or so that we found in the literature. And what we do is then we take those theories and come up with instantiations of them. So something we're starting here, or I should say, we started with Thomas Joyner. He's got essentially a 3-factor or a tripartite model of suicide risk, which includes things like thwarted belongingness, perceived burdensomeness, which you see in much higher rates in things like aging populations where people have serious medical issues start to come up. They start to feel like they're a burden on their family and friends and so on. And then acquired capabilities. So the actual, things like military service and things where people develop the actual ability to go through the physical act. So we take these types of constructs and then we formalize them in natural language. What does that actually look like? What would perceived burdensomeness or acquired capability look like in actual human language? And it looks something kind of like this. I'm not sure how you can see it, but for acquired capability, people say things like, I've been through so much pain in my life that I feel like nothing can hurt me anymore. Essentially getting desensitized to the mere notion of pain. And so we take each one of those, we come up with a few example statements. What does this actually look like in real life? And then we can essentially combine that with some fancy machine learning models that have already been pre-trained, and then quantify that in other texts that we collect, whether we're talking about therapy transcripts, social media posts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so then what we get as output from this approach, essentially actual metrics of how similar is the text in terms of to each one of these different constructs. So you get a metric for each one of those 25 constructs. How much is the text talking like a person who has acquired capability? How much is it talking about? Is it talking or sounding like someone who is high in perceived burdensomeness and so on? And then you can also actually quantify this in these samples themselves. So you can take a text and look at actual snippets of which parts of the text are indicative of which construct, so to speak. So it's not this complete black box thing where you're just crossing your fingers and praying that the metrics come out in a sensible fashion. And when we do this, we find that we do a pretty good job of predicting suicide risk in things like social media in terms of expert annotations, so actual clinical psychologists annotating the posts made by people to, suicide support forums and things like that. And we compare this with other methods too to increase not only the accuracy, but the interpretability of the types of metrics that we're getting out of these types of analyses. And when we do this, we find that our accuracy is really, really good. It converges very nicely with experts who, they know nothing about the method or anything like that. And it performed, in our case, at the very least, better than a lot of LLMs, which is shocking. We're using somewhat older models here. We're not using things like ChatGPT. We're not doing any serious chain of thought reasoning tasks or anything like that. This is very simple. We take the theory, we come up with instances of it, just fuse it into the model, and it's outperforming things like ChatGPT in terms of identifying suicide risk. And I say this, I'm still to this day in awe of things like ChatGPT. They're mind-bogglingly powerful tools. So I think a lot of this is at least very early stages of suggesting that theory still has a place in a lot of this work, that we can still take the stuff that we're doing, even if we're not especially computationally savvy, and get massive gains in performance by just saying theory tells us that this is what we should be looking at, and then putting it into these larger models. Now, me and a subset of some of those teams are expanding this. So we start off by just looking at the Thomas Joyner constructs, but we're drawing into all these other types of constructs, looking at lots and lots and lots of different risk factors of suicide. And we're looking at lots of different types of corpora. So we're taking social media support forms for suicidality, comparing it to just baseline, everyday language people share. For years, I've been collecting lots of suicide notes. So we're seeing kind of an arc that happens in terms of people rising as they get increasingly suicidal, and then a lot of it falling away as they actually approach the act of committing suicide. So, and we're doing this in lots of different ways. We're looking for things like age-related shifts. There should be different underlying motives or causes of suicide across different age groups and populations and so on. And we're starting to explore some of that as well as tracking things like changes over time within individuals. So that's kind of a very quick and dirty hand-wavy example of saying we've got theory. How can we use this with some of the more modern types of tools to get not just better prediction of outcomes we care about, but actually explore the theories that we have and see which ones seem to work, which ones don't, taking a very zoomed out, hands-off approach. Now, we're also starting to do this, being some of the same team and different teams as well, looking at things like violent extremism. So in a similar vein, we're using the same types of methods, but we're being even more agnostic about them in trying to understand things like what causes a person to join extremist groups, we'll say, commit violent acts and so on. So similar, but in a much more exacerbated way than what you see in the suicide literature. The extremism literature is just all over the place. So everyone's concerned about radicalization and extremism in its milder forms, even things like misinformation these days. And there's been a pretty drastic rise in violent extremism domestically and abroad over the past 10 years or so. It's gone up by about 300%. And people are really trying to figure out what to do about this. And even people in national defense are kind of open-minded, saying, we've tried everything we've got. What else can we look at? Now, a lot of the work in extremism over the past, we'll say 80 years or so, really can trace its intellectual roots back to Theodore Adorno, who is it people generally familiar with the F scale? Seem like a little bit mixed. So he's a super interesting guy. So he came up with the F scale, the fascism scale. This is a very early personality psychologists love to claim him as one of their own, but he's a sociologist. Essentially, he was trying to understand what happened in Nazi Germany, what led to this rise in fascism, as were a lot of social psychologists in the 1950s. And so he came up with the F scale, which was supposed to measure not the degree to which someone was an authoritarian, but to what degree does a person, are they kind of predisposed, or are they susceptible to authoritarian or fascist ideology, rhetoric types of thinking? So people really just followed in that vein, developing questionnaires and research paradigms to measure what is essentially authoritarianism or fascism in some form or another. This has really all fallen apart in the last 10 years or so. So you get the rise of things like one of the terms that people use is salad bar extremism. We get these groups like Boogaloo Boys who, if you go in and actually look at their ideologies within those groups, there's no commonality. This is a loose confederation of people who don't believe the same thing. They don't have the same motives. They're just these random clusters of people who want to do serious damage, which is completely at odds with, when you think about Nazi Germany, you think about kind of a core ideology that people flock to, for example. And on top of that, this stuff really falls apart when you look at some recent groups that are increasingly radical. So things like incels, involuntary celibate. So these kind of, this is not a fair characterization, but we'll just say highly misanthropic people or misanthropic, misogynist groups. People who really feel like they're on the bottom rung of society and to some degree are really embracing loathing themselves and everyone else. Very, very different, again, from kind of classic supremacist mindset of extremism research, where we're the best, our group is the best, everyone else sucks. Incels say, we suck, we're the worst, we hate everyone. And it's really difficult to reconcile these. And so people have done a lot of fragmented research using really specific constructs of things like right-wing authoritarianism or kind of an interpersonal circumplex, kind of cold and calculating type of construct for incels. So they're using really specific constructs for really specific groups, and it's just all over the place. And so really our motive here was saying, okay, let's take a step back and just try to pull all of this stuff together, develop a to some degree, at least a first step toward unifying the construct of extremism and radicalization. And so we took a bunch of relatively recent questionnaires right off the shelf that have been used across lots of different extremist groups or extremist ideologies, and look at lots of different constructs. So things like right-wing authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, other measures of extremism, and so on, that all tend to be phrased in terms of, the types of statements you endorse. So I believe this, or this is the way things are, stuff like that. And so we took all of the items from all those questionnaires and used a similar method to what I described with the suicidality research. Essentially, we've got something like 87 different statements. You can then take those statements, go out to real world data and measure how similar is the language of people in various extremist groups to all of these different beliefs and thinking styles and so on. So essentially, it's not too different from if you could actually go out and give these people self-report questionnaires. These are these people's own language, in their own words, in their real lives. We're not prompting them with questions. This is the stuff they're actually talking about out in the real world. And then we can do things like factor analyze those scores, the same way you'd factor analyze this if you just had people ask all these questions. It's also a lot safer than bringing like 1,000 Ku Klux Klan members onto UT Dallas campus and asking to fill out self-report questionnaires. And so we went out, we collected a whole bunch of data. We collected a whole bunch of posts from Stormfront, which is it's not like a heritage white supremacist site. It was around even when I was a kid, a lot of Klan, neo-Nazis, and so on. We also looked at incel subreddits. We have the entire history of all of those subreddits and ISIS articles and a couple of other extremist groups. So kind of have a smorgasbord of kind of ethno-nationalism, religious extremism, misanthropic hatred, and we can also compare those to just general discourse, so just everyday language shared by lots and lots of other people. And when we do that, we can reduce it down to about 11 factors, give or take. We're cheekily calling it the extremist 11 at the moment. And I'm not going to walk through too much of this, but you can quantify each one of these groups to understand what are the commonalities and what are the differences across all of these different aspects that have been theorized to be relevant to violent extremism and radicalization over time. And we see things like that are in many ways very intuitive. Neo-Nazis, white supremacists tend to very strongly endorse things like social dominance orientation, that there's essentially a class of people who should be on top and everyone else should be either eradicated or subservient to the people who are on top. Incels score incredibly high on things like moral detachment. They don't really care if the stuff that they believe is right or wrong, and they're very cold in their personal calculating. Think dark triad types of stuff, psychopathy, Machiavellianism. And, I can remember the third one, narcissism, so to speak. We can also aggregate all this into overall extremism scores so that for any given text that we find out in the real world, we can see to what degree is it extreme along any of these dimensions or all of these dimensions. Try to characterize extremism in a much more, say, broad spotlight. And then we can also use that type of information to actually track people's engagement with these extremist groups over time. So, what we can see, well, there's a few interesting things about this. The first that you can see conceptually, this is very, very similar to Theodore Adorno's line of thinking. You see that there's some people who are just already somewhat different. They're already susceptible or receptive to various types of extremist ideology. Well, you can see in their language easily a year before they actually actively join one of these groups. This is them talking on literally any other type of subreddit. You can see it when they're talking on the bread subreddit or video game subreddit and so on. And as you get increasingly close to them joining one of these groups, you can get insanely, and I mean insanely high AUCs predicting whether or not a person is going to join that group compared to people just joining some other random subreddit or just any other type of group, essentially. Something like 0.9, you can predict with somewhere in the ballpark of 90% class balance accuracy 3 months in advance whether somebody's going to join an extremist group. I want to be mindful of time too, so I know I'm ranting.
7 more minutes.
7 more minutes? All right, I will speed run the last 2 studies. Some closing stuff. So all of that is saying, okay, we've got theories, but we want to either apply them very broadly or we want to pit them against each other and see which ones actually seem to carry water versus which ones don't. There are a lot of cases too where we don't really know what we're looking for, or we have theories, but they come from really specific examples or populations, and we want to see how that stuff shakes out in the real world. So one project that we published a couple of years ago was just looking at relationship problems. So presumably most people here are familiar with Reddit. It's kind of big forum with a zillion subforums. One of these subforums is specific to relationship problems. And we just wanted to see if we could better understand what is the topography of relationship problems that people have. So we have a decent sense of kind of the rank order of different types of relationship problems from things like couples counseling research. There are several meta-analyses that say, okay, these most common ones, these are the least common ones. But there's a massive self-selection issue there. You have to have time, the motivation, and the money to go seek couples counseling in the first place. So we get a very upper middle class type of population there. And it's not necessarily diagnostic of what we see out in the real world, just everyday relationship problems. And so we can use one of these methods I talked about, topic modeling, just to take this massive form of people talking about the problems they have and extracting themes. What are the most statistically identifiable concepts that they are talking about there? And they range from things like heartache over breakups to communication problems and substance usage, on and on and on. Then we can take all of those topics and go back and re-quantify them. So we can take any given text and say, are they talking about communication problems? Are they talking about substance issues? And classify them for every single topic that we get. And when we do this, we see that on average, the typical or the median post is bringing up at least 3 different relationship problems. So it's not that you forgot to put the dishes away and then someone goes, your partner runs to Reddit and says, what do I do? How many red flags do I need to get divorced? But we can compare then the rank order frequency and the relative frequency of all of these different relationship problems with what we know from couples counseling literature. And we see that some types of relationship problems are grossly overrepresented in the literature, communication issues. And in other cases, we see that what we're finding out in the general public is really on par with what we find in couples counseling, things like domestic issues, financial issues, and household chores and things like that. we also get to, it feels kind of like we're wearing X-ray specs to some degree. We can see things that do not show up that much in couples counseling, which is things like intimate partner violence and physical abuse. And the numbers that we get are actually right in the ballpark of the CDC estimates for lifetime history of intimate partner violence and sexual abuse and so on. Whereas you only see about, it's less than a tenth of that shows up in actual couples counseling. So the key idea here is it gives us a broad picture of what are these things looking like out in the real world? How prevalent are these types of problems and so on? I'm going to actually skip this one just for the sake of time.
Sure. We'll have more
I'll give
time
you
for
the
questions.
30-second version. The short version, are people in here generally familiar with the construct of emotional granularity, emotional differentiation? The idea is essentially that the better you're able to label your emotions, at least all these kind of positive downstream affective benefits. So like there's a whole very elaborate and very well thought out theory behind a lot of this. But for example, let's say you are using your friend's phone and you drop it and it breaks. If you just feel bad, it doesn't necessarily suggest any particular action you're supposed to engage in to like rectify that. Whereas if you feel guilty, that's going to lead to you saying like, okay, I need to do something about this and on and on and on. The idea is that the more precisely you're able to label and differentiate your emotions, the more you're able to accurately grapple with those emotions, manage them, regulate them, do things about them. What's not particularly understood is how people develop emotional granularity. There's a zillion studies out there that show that it's positive. Emotional granularity is good. People with high emotional granularity have lower rates of depression, alcohol and substance use disorders. And if you study from a psychopathology perspective, people with schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder tend to have lower emotional granularity. So we know for the most part that's very good. We don't really understand where it comes from or why. And so we sought to try to use the same method, this topic modeling method, to stitch together at least an interim understanding of how this works. So we did several EMA studies, and this is work that was led by Katie Hageman, who's I think at University of Kansas now. She's absolutely brilliant. And the short version is randomly throughout the day, people were getting pings and they were filling out essentially kind of PANIS type of questionnaires, which emotions are you feeling and how strongly right now. Then we also asked them just, what are you doing right now? Where are you? What's happening in your life? And so on. And so fast forward. We extracted all the topics. What are all the different experiences you're having throughout the day over like a 2-week span or so? And we can calculate how diverse are your experiences, how much you gain out in doing different things in the world. So we can calculate diversity of that using an inverse Gini coefficient, and we can use a standard emotional granularity method. So we get essentially diversity of emotions experienced and diversity of actual, lived experiences, so to speak. And we find that these two things link up very, very nicely. You can kind of see in this one that the people with low emotional granularity who don't really differentiate all the negative emotions that they have, they also have really high Gini coefficient. They don't have a lot of diversity experiences, whereas more emotional granularity corresponds to much more kind of rich life experiences, we'll say. So there's a lot of theory that suggests that this should be the case, that those experiences help you kind of develop more, we'll say, tuned in affective prediction systems in your mind. But I could talk about this for like 4 days straight, so I'll shut up there. Multiverse analyses, very cool, very fun, it holds up. And these methods are being used by myself and folks in my lab and my colleagues across lots and lots and lots and lots of different topics, ranging from things like self-beliefs. So we talk about ourselves a lot in everyday life. We extract self-beliefs. What does that tell us about everything going on in your life, how you think, social norms, quantifying norms that people's parents place on them, and breaking those down. What are those norms? Which ones seem to be most stressful, damaging, protective, et cetera, et cetera. Doing lots of projects looking at social media data, text messages, and EMA data for all use disorders, for example, seeing if we can predict who's at highest risk and relapses, how many drinks people are having, and on and on and on. And of course, like a lot of people, we're moving very heavily into the generative AI as well. So we're using a lot of these just ridiculously powerful generative AI. So things like Mistral, Llama, GPT, and on to extract all kinds of elaborate psychological information about people just based on their language data. And so conclusions, language is everywhere, collect language. If you're not collecting language data now, do in all of your studies, just have people write for 5 minutes stream of consciousness, because all of these things, they're still evolving. I'm revisiting data I collected 10 years ago now with new tools and seeing things I never even imagined I would see back when I originally collected it. There's just so much stuff that can be done with language data, and the burden of collecting it is really, really, really minimal. And of course, I'm always happy to chat about this stuff. You just can't get me to shut up about it. And of course, these are all projects that have had a zillion people involved, insanely smart, hardworking, talented people. And there's a million that aren't on this slide here. So, of course, science is a collaborative effort. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. It's time for questions.
I guess, you've covered a huge amount, and some of it, a lot of very diverse areas. I guess some of what you were saying, particularly at the beginning, struck me as being, I don't mean this pejoratively at all, but it seemed like computationally intense folk psychology. So in other words, you're using people's self-commentary, or you're using their language as a way of trying to explain how they understand themselves, how they articulate the causes of their own behavior, etc. But of course, that is exactly what folk psychology is. It's a set of beliefs that are culturally shared about what it is that makes us do things, and then how we can rationalize it afterwards. Essentially, what I was seeing here was a very sophisticated way of essentially statistically and computationally doing that. But the weakness of folk psychology is that it tells us nothing actually deep about what really is going on under the hood.
That's right.
And so it's a great approach descriptively, but I'm left thinking, so in a sense, so what? How is this going to help me understand mechanistically how people behave? We know that people give articulated causes for their behavior that we know are incorrect. Because people have done great experiments to demonstrate this. There's a lot of attribution, a lot of self, kind of lying to yourself, so to speak. I don't mean that, but deliberate. Yeah. So, how do you respond to that criticism? This is fantastic, but it's not telling us what we really want to know, which is why and how do people behave the way they do.
Yeah. So it's a great question there. There's a lot of things I could say. I think that I'll try to limit it to two of the higher levels. So one of them is that the language that we're collecting and then decomposing into lots of different measures comes from all over the place. So it's not necessarily that we're just bringing people in the lab and saying, well, tell me why it is that you married your partner, or why it is that you went to the store on Tuesday. Because of course we do it all the time, right? People criticize ChatGPT for just making up answers when it doesn't know truth. And of course, humans do the same thing constantly. We have a zillion reasons that seem plausible for our own behavior, but have no basis or minimal basis in reality. But that's not necessarily the type of language we're getting. So I didn't get into it here, but I've been really pushing this return to the concept of verbal behavior rather than just language as kind of a therapy construct. And that what we're doing is, in many ways, no different from what a lot of folks have started doing in the past 10 years in the mobile sensing space, where you can install an app on your smartphone and quantify a zillion different sensors, things like accelerometer, GPS data, light sensors, everything. And those are all essentially indicators of what a person is doing. We're approaching language very much from the same way. So you find lots of places where, so one of the classic things is self-referential language, where first person singular pronouns in particular, I, me, and I. We can completely decontextualize those for lots of reasons. Doesn't matter what a person is talking about. It just depends, are they talking about themselves? So, if you have two people go out to dinner and then ask them the next day, what was dinner like? How was dinner? One person might be like, oh, we had a great time. These things happened and then we did this afterwards. Another person would be entirely self-focused. Well, I showed up at this time. This is what I ordered, et cetera, et cetera. First person singular pronouns, these self-focused indicators. Folk psychology is that people who talk about themselves all the time, they're blowhards, they're narcissists, et cetera. And that has absolutely no basis in any study that we've ever done. In fact, the first person singular pronouns are quite the opposite. It's really one of the most robust, reliable indicators of depression, for example. So, some older theories of depression are that it's essentially a disease of self-focus and inability to kind of get back outside of oneself and so on. And so essentially we're taking language as just one stream of behavior. It's an output that a person is generating as they move through life. And we're finding what are the patterns in that stream of behaviors that connect with something that's happening under. So this whole words as attention thing, I'll see if I can quickly back up to this slide. The idea here really is what we are. I have so many slides. So I'm even the ones I was looking at. So the idea here is that there are all these mental operations and schemas and everything else that are happening that have, to various degrees, some influence on our attentional processes. Identity has an influence on what you pay attention to in life. And that, to some degree, then comes out in your language as well. Or you talk about X or Y or Z, is telling us what is it that you're attending to, rather than going into the meaning and saying, well, what does this person believe about this? So it's much, much less qualitative, much more of this kind of abstraction of what are the things that are happening behind the scenes as we can detect them in language, so to speak. I fear I'm probably over-explaining this. Ironically, we're actually doing a large-scale project right now, looking at people's explanations of their own behaviors. It's kind of a study on folk psychology. That's like a whole different stream.
I have time for one more question. I'll ask them. And it's a little bit following up. In your research, is there examples that took the knowledge and was able to apply it in a way that was then making a change, or was it really just a descriptive capturing what you see? And I think it's an expansion of that question, because maybe for apply, you do want to know more mechanistic of what's under the hood, so you know what would be an effective way to manipulate.
Absolutely. So we do a fair amount of intervention types of work. So a lot of it really is identifying kind of how does, so like this is a somewhat older line, but I think it holds true. At the end of the day, a lot of the people doing this work, we don't actually care about language at all. Like I thought language and grammar was just the absolutely most brutal topic in school. I'm shocked I work with language now, but we only care about it in this verbal behavioral context to the degree that language provides us an insight to things that are psychological in nature. And you can do it using virtually any type of behavioral activity. Language just kind of has a weird special quality because it's so rich with lots of meaning implicit to it. So if someone like waves their hand it's hard to know what does that mean psychologically without lots and lots and lots of contextual information. But if someone says, "Hi, how are you doing?" you can infer with pretty good degree of certainty like what it is they're trying to do, actual interpersonal. So I think I'm straying really, really far away from the question. So when we're doing intervention work, we're not doing it through. So it's kind of a fool's errand to try to change language to change psychology, so to speak. Have to work the other direction around. Then use language. Is there an actual change in what they're tending to? What's going on in their lives and stuff? It's like I get the question a lot. People teach people to talk like this where they become confident. Usually what I say is like, no, teach them to be confident and talk more. But increasingly a lot of this stuff is also being used for things like suicidality, extremism. Can you identify people who are at risk based on patterns around full time? So a lot of work historically doing this stuff was very cross-sectional. Bring 100 people in the lab or 100 documents from different people. Increasingly, we're doing something essentially within the subject over time. So I have a very good sense that these are patterns that are stable in terms of what are they thinking about, how are they thinking. And, the extremist stuff is especially interesting. It's like it suggests a really we'll just say constant things that a person is really like if someone walked in this room and just started talking about like immigrants for 45 minutes, I'd be like, person like something is really wrong upstairs. They're like hyper focused on this topic. The same way that I'm hyper focused on language, you may like something's really wrong. I want you to like language that much. Yeah, I'll shut up there.
Great.
Yes.
Yes. Camila, are there any questions on the chat?
Yeah, we have 2 questions. The first question reads, what identity and personality remains in a person when hemorrhagic stroke permanently damages Broca's area speech center and Wernicke's area comprehension cortex and global aphasia?
What?
Sorry.
Is the question essentially about if you're breaking the link between other aspects of a person's cognition and their language generation processes? What does it tell us?
That's it, right?
Fair? Okay, yeah. So I mean, there is there's a lot of work, not so much on that area, although there is a good amount of work there. Probably the closest analog would be things like dementia, the various forms of dementia. We get these degenerations that are happening that impact a person's speech and language. Most of the research there that I've found is really focused on kind of, it's much more psycholinguistic. It's on the actual generation of language. Can you diagnose someone or foreshadow their cognitive decline based on nuanced changes in like language construction and so on? So I think that there's work there where the verbal behavior itself is still telling you something about cognitive processes that are in operation. Good. There's some other stuff that's more in my wheelhouse. We never published this, but we were doing some work on Alzheimer's specifically, where you would see progressions in as a person was progressing in their dementia, they started using very marked increases in social language. They started referring to people, their environment, at statistically higher rates, suggesting to us at the very least that it was telling us something about the ways in which their kind of awareness was changing. They were looking to people in the environment for social cues a lot more when they weren't kind of really getting what was going on themselves. So I know none of this is directly on point for the question, but I think that even in those contexts, there's still, as long as there's language being generated, it has to be being generated by stuff that's happening in the brain and the mind itself. I don't think we have a super powerful understanding of the entire pathway.
Yeah.
And the second question?
The second question asks, do displayed body tattoos interfere with or distract from verbal communication deficiency?
Yes.
Great.
I'll stop there.
So join me in again in thanking Dr. Boyd for also facilitates, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, yeah.
Oh, great job.
Yeah. Like, let's go.